most of the times the result doesn't include any of the design logic. So then we have a model, but if we want to make any changes to it, everything has to be done manually again. So the idea is to really improve upon this process, to empower architects, designers, to translate their abstract design concepts into tangible 3D models effectively and efficiently, containing the design logic. And you could say, well, parametric modeling does that. Yes, parametric modeling can embed some of the design logic into the model, but it typically requires explicit and very time-consuming definitions of rules, parameters, and associations. And therefore, there's this technical complexity, a time latency, and this kind of disrupts the design process and design exploration. So we're not saying that parametric modeling is not useful, but the process of creating a parametric models takes too much time and is too complex. And the alternative to consider definitions for every conceivable architecture composition, of course, is not realistic. So our idea is basically to use AI to be able to generate, for example, a parametric model that can contain some of the design logic in such a way that it can be done quickly. And so this integrates well into the design workflow. Now, how to do that? We're looking at design patterns because these are fundamental to describing the building, the ideation and reasoning process, in decomposing it into its constituents, hopefully ontologically consistent parts. The advantage of these decomposing the buildings into its ontological parts is that you get a formal vocabulary that provides a stable starting point for further computational efforts. And it also affords for descriptions and generative processes to be isolated to each element. Basically, some of the points that Wasim was talking about, the integration of meaning and geometry and topology and maybe other aspects. Now, if we look at the literature, of course, Christopher Alexander with his design patterns and Musavi with the idea of assemblages, they're all looking at foundational elements in architectural design that allow for compositions of elements that imply some of the logic. And we're particularly looking at a work of José Bairao on urban induction patterns, because it has some components, some aspects that we think are very relevant and important. Firstly is the ontological categories of objects and actions. Two is the inclusion of generative behaviors. And three, the production of semantically sound outputs. So our work at this moment is a little bit built upon that. Obviously, obviously, José Bairao's work was done at the urban scale, and we're focusing on the architectural scale. So here's just some of the work, some of the examples of the patterns that he identified. And so for a concept as grid, for example, there are two different patterns. One that is adds axial lines, the other one that adds building blocks or block cells. And so there's multiple ways to achieve a same result. And the reasoning, the logic, the interactions are embedded in the patterns as he defines it. So in our way of thinking, we considering this concept of compositional neural patterns. So the neural already, of course, points to the AI role that we think is necessary. The compositional draws upon the compositional nature that we think is inherent in architectural design, but we view it through the lens of category theory, which is a mathematical tool that is also grounded in compositionality. So we think that there's a very good correspondence between category theory and what we are aiming for. And so in category theory, there are three basic conceptual elements defined. These are objects, morphisms, and compositions. And so translating these to design, the design objects are design components, are building blocks, but they don't have to be physical elements of the building. They can also be conceptual aspects or building blocks. The morphisms point to the design logic. This is the interactions between these design components. And then the compositions, of course, are compositions of these elements and morphisms that define that embed the design components and their logic. Now, in our current implementation, as I said, we're currently just demonstrating it using a parametric model. We basically borrow mostly from object-oriented programming and graphs. So we kind of see our components as classes or instances of classes, where a class or a superclass would define some standardization, and then every instance or subclass can define a design object or an instance of a design object rather that adheres to the same standardized representational format, so that there is some generality that we can reason upon. The methods in the classes define the possible morphism behaviors of design objects, the interactions, the way the patterns, the way the input is taken and translated into the output. And then the multi-layered graphs serve for the compositions. And we are specifically enamored by multi-layered graphs because we think that these different layers can then represent different aspects of the design, so that we don't have to necessarily envision everything as one large entity, but we can distinguish different sub-compositions. So this initial demonstration, we're calling it generative patterns. And so in terms of the design objects, basically these are the fundamental elements, of course, that are equivalent to the objects in category theory. And we do understand or adopt the inheritance systems of the classes, so where each embodies specific properties. So in a simple example for a grid, and I will demonstrate this later, but a grid collection could basically be made up of two sets of grid lines, potentially orthogonal to each other. But each grid set of lines could be defined by different patterns. So we could have a standard pattern, we could have an AB pattern leading to a tartan grid, for example, or even an ABB pattern. So there may be different implementations for the same concept or design object. Then the design morphisms are the functions that act upon these objects, and they translate the abstract patterns into the high-dimensional representations, reflecting the intended spatial arrangements or the transformations. So in this particular case, of course, for a grid, it could be quite straightforward, but in general, we could imagine that it could be a procedural algorithm, like we will demonstrate with our parametric model, but it could also be an AI model or other methods that take these inputs and then translate them into the appropriate output. And then finally, of course, we have our design compositions. And here we utilize directed acyclic graphs to express basically with our data flow relationships, conveying the construction sequences of the design. So for example, I mean, this will be part of the example that we're showing is we're starting from a site. Based on that, we're defining a grid collection. We're defining a few formal massings, and then some levels and a start of a structural system in terms of some columns. So this is the case study that I will use to quickly demonstrate the idea. It's the Lever House in New York, and we chose this basically because it's a conventional building, yet not as simple. I mean, it's a relatively complex, but still it's conventional building. There's, of course, a lot of extensive literature about it, and we're also interested by the fact that it mirrors Nathaniel Owing's vision for an ideal office tower. So, you know, can we create a model for an ideal office tower? Although very specifically, we're just doing this for the Lever House. So starting with the site, so there's a component in Grasshopper that defines the site design object and takes a number of input parameters and has a pattern or an algorithm inside of it that will create this particular site. And then we define a grid design object. And so basically, as I said, it basically goes by defining two sets of grid lines and then combining them into a grid object. And maybe I should have shown that in the case of the Lever House, so the grid is fairly simple in the sense that it's a simple equal spaced grid, except for one of the grid columns, one of the grid spaces rather, that is extended with respect to the rest. So in this particular case, you don't see that yet. We're doing that step in the next design object, although you know, it could have easily been done here. We've cut some corners, obviously, doing this in order to be able to demonstrate this as efficiently as possible. Let's say it like that. So then the next step is the tower massing. So the tower massing takes as input not a specific geometry, but it is aligned with the grid. So it basically tells which grid cells it relates to. And you can see that best on the right, because the block is also raised a little bit to the ground level. So you don't see it in the isometry as well. And there is also because of course the columns are on the grid, so the facade of the block stands a little bit outwards. So there's also one input factor which defines how much the scaling basically is of the block with respect to the grid. But so everything is defined in relationship to previous steps, so that this design logic is embedded. And then the next step is the podium and the courtyard. So here, actually, the podium is designed to take up the whole site, or at least the whole complete grid. So what is left out are the incomplete grid cells. And again, there's it extends a little bit beyond the beyond the grid itself. And then the courtyard is actually also defined as a similar object, a massing design object. And then it's just a simple Boolean operation to subtract the courtyard from the podium. The courtyard is also specified to be aligned with the tower, so that relationship is embedded. And so so even though they're all massing design objects, they all take different components in order to take because they have different patterns or different relationships embedded within it. And then we went on a little bit further beyond the massing. So the floors. So in this particular case, it's a series of massing design objects that are created corresponding the floor-to-floor height. But in light of topologic, this could also have been, of course, a combination of a solid with surfaces. It really depends on what you want the outcome, the result to be. And then this is the final step. I mean, this is as far as we took this demonstration, is to show basically place the columns as a start of a structural system that, of course, are aligned with the grid and go throughout the volumes. And as is with a parametric model, of course, you can then apply this to many different sites, and it will automatically adapt to the form of the site. So it's just to demonstrate this flexibility. So in conclusion, there's a few things I want to talk about. So the first thing, of course, is that actually it's not entirely reflecting of Nathaniel Owens' description of this ideal office tower, because he starts with the description of form and experience, not with the site. Now, we took this hierarchical approach starting from the site because it made it a lot easier, but it's not impossible, of course, to imagine that you start from the form and that then this is adjusted to the site, so the form can be expressed with or without a grid, and then the grid adjusted to the site, or the form adjusted to the grid, whatever. Experience, of course, is a different aspect that we'd have to figure out how, experience can be actually encoded in a way that it can also participate in the design logic. The other aspect is compositionality. I mean, it is very important, of course, but maybe it's not a property of the design itself, but of our models of the design. So this is something to think about. And then, of course, finally, it remains this very simplified model. But so the idea is that, of course, we can use AI to generate the lever house. But if the result is just the lever house and it doesn't, well, either it doesn't embed the design logic, it's a black box, then it's not very useful. Because I think as architects, we're not really interested in just generating some buildings and then afterwards saying, I like this, I don't like that. We want to be able to, communicate in a dialogue, possibly with our tools in order to achieve what we want. And we may not know what we want initially. So the idea, as I said, is to use AI to basically generate these components in our larger model, such that we can talk to the AI and it can combine this model, this parametric model, or any other algorithmic model in a way that it thinks it responds to our questions. And then if we don't like things, I mean, we could go further into the exploration, but so that we can avoid this very tedious process of creating 3D models that correspond to our design abstract, so that we can go better back or keep working in what Donald Schoen calls the C move C cycles, also in the generation of the 3D model. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
For the presentation with the title Leveraging Graph-Based Machine Learning to Represent and Generate Architectural Layouts.
Just give it a while. It's doing stable diffusion, as you can see. There. Oh. Okay. Yeah. No moving. Okay. Hi, my name is Aries Yang, and I'm from the Future City Lab Global at Singapore ETH Center. Today, I'm very excited to share about my research layered graph framework for generative architectural design, exploring DGMG and graph GPT models for building footprint generation. This work is co-authored with Professor Rudi, he just presented just now, from the National University of Singapore. Our research explores how generative graph models can be used in architectural design, focusing on building footprints with a layered graph framework. This project is a step in a bigger thesis on a generative design with graph representation. We evaluate two methods, the first being deep generative models of graphs, DGMG, proposed by Lee and Lee al. 2018, as well as Graph GPT, a transformer-based model adapted for graph generation. Our aim is to investigate how these two models can contribute to the creating of architectural layouts, as well as 3D mapping models with structural integrity and spatial coherence. By focusing on building footprints, we establish a foundational layer within our proposed layered graph framework, which can be extended to more complex architectural representations. Traditional CAD systems, while enhancing productivity and precision, often rely on fixed parametric modeling. This rigid structure can limit the designer's flexibility and creativity, making it a bit challenging to explore more complex and innovative designs. They also struggle to capture the intricate relationships inherent in architectural design, leading to some difficulties in understanding and reusing the design intent and knowledge embedded within the parametric models. Graph-based approaches, on the other hand, offer a viable solution to these challenges. By using graph architectural representations, we can effectively capture both geometric and semantic information in architectural plans. This relational structure aligns pretty well with the interconnected nature of architectural design, allowing for a bit more nuanced representation of architectural spaces and design reasoning. Additionally, these graphs can embed various attributes related to spaces, facilitating spatial analysis and reasoning tasks. By using these representations, we can better understand and manipulate complex design relationships. But first, let's take a look at what exactly is graph. I think Professor Wasim just now already introduced to you guys. I just do a quick run through. Graph theory is a concept in mathematics and computer science. It was first theorized by mathematician Euler to solve the 7 bridges of Königsberg, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. A graph is essentially a collection of vertices or nodes connected by the edges, and these edges represent relationships. The graphs can also include labels that provide additional information or context about the structure. So these are the nodes, vertices, edges that connects the different nodes together, and then the label that labels each graph. I mean, sometimes your nodes and your edges can also have labels, which contribute to the node features and edge features. And graphs aren't really abstract concepts. They can directly correspond to spatial elements. For example, some nodes might represent physical locations like buildings, and the edges could denote pathways or visual connections to different spaces. And you can see how this graph structure of 3 nodes with 3 edges can sort of represent 3 columns together, and that's in the middle is a space. And then over there is my beautiful campus with 3 entrances. Then you can see how they're connected through like a adjacency matrix. Yeah, so for adjacency matrix, that is how computer looks at graphs. So yeah, this is pretty self-explanatory here. The matrix captures the connections between nodes in a numerical format where rows and columns represent nodes and the values indicate edges. So with this versatility of graph representation, it leads us to think about how we can use this to explore the very different level of detail in design. So we propose a sort of layer graph framework for computational architectural design. And in this framework, the nodes are architectural elements, edges are the relationships between them, and the different layers represent the very different level of detail in the architectural space. It could be a facade kind of thing, or it could be spatial details themselves. So it's very flexible. And this layer approach helps architects distinguish between the big picture elements and the very minute finer details. And by organizing these nodes into layers, we can capture the different levels of this abstraction, which will help us and the computer to understand the design. Our study experiments with 2 generative capabilities of 2 models, the DGMG and the GraphGPT, using building footprint data from Central Washington. Oh, sorry. I must have skipped the slide somewhere. Yeah, so this is the initial step towards understanding how building programs relate to their building footprints within our multi-layer framework. By focusing on building footprints, we aim to examine how building function influences spatial configuration. And starting as this as a foundational step, ultimately, this study contributes to the understanding of how generative models can be applied within this multi-layer framework to generate coherent and structurally sound architectural designs. The generative models based on graph data transform design requirements into graph representation and using computational techniques to generate feasible solutions that meet specific design constraints. This allows us to explore novel configurations that might not be emerged from traditional CAD modeling. By leveraging these models, architects can automate aspects of the design process and focus on higher level reasoning, give us a bit more space to think about other stuff. First, let's take a look at DGMG, which uses the Deep Graph library. DGMG is designed to generate graph structured data, and it learns underlying patterns in the graph to create new graphs that share similar properties with the training data. DGMG generates graph incrementally, constructing them node by node and edge by edge, based on the learned probabilistic rules. In each step, the model will decide whether to add a node or not. And if it adds a node, it determines whether edges are needed. And if edges are needed, you will select existing nodes to connect to and add edges based on the graph structure. And this process uses the graph neural network, or GNN in short, to maintain coherence in the generated graph by encoding decisions as probabilities. DGMG is pretty useful in architecture because it handles both spatial and structural relationships. By adding nodes like rooms or spaces and edges, which are like connections like doors or functional connections like corridors, this is done iteratively. It simulates how architects build upon designs, adding details progressively. And in doing so, we can sort of allow the model to respect spatial constraints and maintain functional relationships between the spaces. The second model we are discussing is the Graph GPT, which adapts transformer architecture to generate and learn graph structures. Graph GPT transforms architectural graphs into sequences of tokens, ensuring that the sequence is both reversible and it retains all the information of the original graph. This is to allow it to process graph data sequentially, much like a sentence in a language model, which is essentially a LLM-based task, and learn complex spatial relationships. By pre-training on the next token prediction task, Graph GPT learns to predict the next element in the sequence, capturing the design logic inherent in the architectural task. So for the methodology, we use building footprint data from Central Washington, DC for our experiments. The data includes key architectural elements such as building outlines, areas, and program types like residential, commercial, and among others. We converted these data into graph representations, where nodes represent the points on the building outlines and edges represent the connections between these points. Additionally, we embedded programmatic information within these graphs to enable the model to generate design solutions sensitive to these specific keywords. This approach allows us to examine how the building function influences these spatial layouts and configurations, starting with the building footprint data as a foundational step. For DGMG, we modify it to handle node features like 2D coordinates and attributes. We incorporated a conditional variational autoencoder, or in short, CVAE, to learn the node attribute distribution based on program graphs. The CVAE learns the distribution of the node features from the training data, and then allow the actual model to sample the relevant features during generation. This ensures that the generated nodes fit spatial and functional requirements, and that the spatial characteristics of the generated footprints are influenced by the building's programmatic label. For the Graph GPT side, we adapted it to turn spatial and topological information into token sequences. We refined the tokenization process to include key attributes like program labels and node positions, ensuring that the important spatial and functional information were preserved. By pre-training on next token prediction, the model learns design logic and stays sensitive to program keywords. With Graph GPT, the initial results were pretty promising. The model could sort of learn the nodal locational embedding well, but in later stages, we encountered significant challenges. One of these challenges is actually to transform this transformer-based model into an architectural graph data pose a lot of challenges, especially in tokenizing complex graph structures into sequences without losing some important spatial and relational information. DGMG, on the other hand, which was originally designed to generate graphs, was quite effective. It effectively generated coherent architectural graphs. It captured essential spatial relationships and integrated well with the build footprint data, producing structurally valid outputs for various program labels. Over here is basically we have the input data in the input node features, which are the positions, and then we made it recreate this based on the probability of the nodes. And you can see it's somewhat very comparable in training and generation. And these are some of the processes of during the training. I printed out some of the graphs. So you can see how it's been trained. But of course, not everything goes according to plan. The DGMG model was pretty effective, but we did face some challenges. The model sometimes produced graphs with limited variation, particularly for certain program types, which in the data set was there were lesser of these. So the data set wasn't really that even. Yeah. So as you can see from the top, that is the training program. Then below is the ground truth samples. Ground truth samples mean that these are the actual data. As you can see, the last one compared to this, there's a lot of, I would say there's a lot of differences between the actual thing and the generated data. And Comparing between the two models, DGMG's graph native approach fits pretty well with architectural layouts. It integrates easily with architectural data and produces structurally coherent design. This is somewhat like how architects think they design iteratively, right? So it sort of has a lot of potential in that. And GraphGPT has a potential for handling complex tasks and integrating different types of data, thanks to its transformer-based architecture, and is very, very supported in the current climate. However, it does require a lot of adaptation and resources to be effective for architectural graph generation. And the computational demands and challenges in tokenizing the actual graph data suggest that there is a lot of further research that we need to adapt. In future developments, we think that the multi-layered graph representation of architecture is pretty fascinating, and it's a very new area as well, I think. And it's very exciting to explore. Developing models which can handle multiple layers simultaneously, capturing the interaction between different aspects of the building like structure, space, and materials. This will provide us with a lot more holistic representation of the architectural designs. And also, we should be developing models that can handle multiple layers as well. Explore how the layer approach can improve collaboration between different disciplines. That is a very current problem that we need to solve. Collaboration such as architects, engineers, and urban planners by providing a sort of shared detailed representation, which we hope that this might be able to do it. We should be creating more and larger and more diverse data sets that includes various building types and there are multiple layers of detail. And this will help in training models to generate better across different architectural contexts. We should be investigating a lot more into hybrid models that sort of combine the strength of graph neural networks and as well as other models such as LLMs. In terms of the LLM part, GraphGPT part, we should be looking for ways to improve the tokenizing strategies for models so that you can better adapt to the graph data. And in conclusion, our study highlights the strength and the limitations of graph native and transformer-based models in architectural design. The multi-layered graph framework offers a very exciting way to represent architecture more holistically. And this work is a first step towards developing generative models that can create architectural layouts with a focus on design reasoning and spatial coherence. And thank you for your attention. I would like to thank my prof and a few contributing people.
Okay, and now I call Alessio Erioli, assembler, a tool for computational decision at scale in combinatorial generation of architectural spaces.
Sorry. Thank you very much. My name is Alessio Erioli. I teach at the University of Bologna. I teach computational design since 2009, and in course of architectural design for building engineering architecture students. I wrote this tool that I'm presenting today to explore some specifics about the configuration of how space is formed and to explore some kind of possible novel configuration of space in relation to function as well. So Assembler is a computational tool designed for Rhino and Grasshopper, for the Rhino and Grasshopper environment, its purpose is the design and study of spatial assemblages in architecture, with a focus on generating heterogeneous spaces using combinatorial growth in particular. So what I mean by combinatorial design is kind of procedure that aims at achieving complexity and variety through the repetition and arrangement of basic parts. And it works through an open-ended patterning of units or parts, if you will. Some notable precedents and precursors in the method, more than explicitly calling combinatorial design, you can also see Frank Lloyd Wright doing some proto-algorithmic or combinatorial kind of growth. Pete Blom on the bottom left, Yona Friedman with the flat writer, for sure Moshe Safdie with the Habitat 67 comes to mind. This is an analysis done by, I don't remember the name, but I will give you the quote if you're interested. And more recently, other architects, such as the example you see here in yellow and blue is from Daniel Köhler in studio at the Bartlett some years ago. And for sure, the first formalization in terms of methods to be applied to a computational application of combinatorial growth comes from Georges Stini with his paper on kindergarten grammars, where the last image on the right is taken, where he formalizes a way of writing rules to how to put parts together. And he uses the verbal gifts to exemplify that. So that's why it's called kindergarten grammars. What's an assemblage? To refer to the concept of assemblage, I refer to the formulation of Manuel de Landa, to Deleuze and Guattari, as then extended by Manuel de Landa. So in synthesis, I won't present you with the cross graph that is usually accompanied when one puts the Deleuze and Guattari concept of assemblage, but it's a social spatial network where identities and qualities emerge from interaction between parts, where connectivity and flow take precedence in understanding what's going on over objects and form, and in which design is an act of striation. And striation refers directly to the smooth and the striated. So it's an act of ordering where you place boundaries, something quantifiable, in order to enable flows. That there's something that it's harder to quantify. One very important addendum to this slide is that when one considers assemblages, one has always to consider that an assemblage is more a perspective on things, not an object. It's a way of understanding how certain things work as an assemblage. So to exemplify it better in terms of a range of architectural manifestations or system manifestation, if you want, you can think about assemblages as something in between a range that has two extremities. One where you have juxtapositions in which we have dominance of parts where relations are relevant. A capital is a capital, and you can perfectly identify it as a capital and nothing else and nothing more, whether you take it on its own or whether you take it in a system with a column and a tympanum and everything else. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the organicist metaphor, where kind of the inverse happens. You have a dominance of relations that individual parts are meaningless. The parts take meaning only when they are in relation with another. All the other relations are relations of interiority to define the organism. So there is no individuality. Anything that is taken away from the organism loses its meaning. In assemblages, there is a form of interdependence where objects and relation coexist. And objects have both internal and relational characteristics, properties and capacities, as per the Landa names them. If some of you remembers the classical example of the knife, a property is how sharp is the blade, because you can measure the angle. And a capacity is the capacity of the knife to cut, which depends on the capacity of an object to be cut by the knife. So properties are limited, capacities are potentially endless, because you can put an object in an infinite set of relation and determine the capacities only when it gets into relation. So the same happens with the parts in an assemblage. A part says properties or an individual identity, but then it can have and acquire different identities according to how it is used in an assemblage. And I'm talking about part as opposed as units because they are two different things. So a unit is something that is functionally predefined. It's finalized and it's contained. It has a fixed identity, just like the flats, or let's say the boxes that compose the flat in Habitat 67, as you see here. While a part can acquire further properties or identities in an assemblage. So this is something that's called mereological individuation, where the individuation of an identity acquires in the relation between the part and the whole. And lastly, before going more into the tool, I conceptualize parts as computing objects. So there are spatial components, so components that are enclosed parts of space that affect flow and enable a form of computation at multiple scales. So in this case, it attached to this is a concept of conceiving design as a network of decisions, where you have granular decisions that are encoded into procedures and criteria. To better explain these two parts, I'm using this kind of, sorry, it's a little bit of a blunt metaphor if you want, but it kind of takes the point across. If you think about how computation works at the very basic level, I mean the very basic level, every chip in every computer is based on these 7 logical gates. And the logical gates regulates flow of electrons, basically. So to perform a more complex operation like this one, you compose these logical gates that regulate flow. So any complex operation, any operation that is not those of the logical gates, is made by spatializing the flows, putting the flows into space. So exactly like you do in an architecture or in a city, to enable complex functional programs, you enable the possibility of complex flow, complex regulation of flow. And that little neighborhood over there that you see is actually the Pong game. Because before programming languages, programming a video game was a matter of putting these logical gates together, and the chips were bundles of logical gates put together. So it's effectively, it regulates the flow just as much as a city regulates its own flow, inputs, interactions. There are recently also some programming languages from MIT that try to visualize the flow. I think it was Lambda something. I didn't put the example, but because it was digressing. So the way in which assembler is structured, those were the conceptual premises. So the ways in which the tools is structured, it's structured as a Grasshopper plugin that you can find on Food for Rhino. It's been there since a couple of years or probably more. And a .NET DLL library that lies underneath the Grasshopper plugin. So you can also script using the methods and the classes included in Grasshopper. From the standpoint of methodology, what assembler does is try to answer over and over the same question, this question: where do I place the next component? So this apparently simple question can be decomposed, or is decomposed into assembler in a series of further steps. So first of all, I have to locate a component that can receive my new component. So that's called the receiver. So the first part is selecting the receiver, where I'm placing the next part. Then what is the next part? Once I locate the receiver, the software processes all the possible candidates that can fit into that receiver. Then according to another selection criteria, selects which one amongst the possible candidates is the winning candidates, and then places the new component, updates the assemblage, and starts over again from the next iteration. In terms of definition anatomy, this is how the typical assembler-related definition goes inside the Grasshopper. So you have, as in all simulation systems like Kangaroo, like Millipede, Caramba, anything, you have these three parts of the process, which are setup, simulate, post-process. Assembler is no different than in this regard. So you have to set up three basic things: the parts, the endogenous settings, the settings that are proper to the system itself, intrinsic to the system, so rules, how the parts can connect together, the criteria, how the rules are selected, and these are parts of the heuristic settings. And exogenous settings, so something related to the environment. So you can set up environmental objects, distribute data into space, so that the assemblage, as it grows, it can relate to that data and perform decision based on that distributed data. Then you have an engine that performs the operation that you've seen just before, and then you have some post-processing operation. An important note is that parts are actually divided into two different sets of geometric information. There is a geometric information that is essential to the engine to perform the assemblage, and there is extended data that is then assigned after the assemblage has occurred. So the anatomy of the typical part starts from a collision mesh. So the parts, the geometry of the space that needs to be reserved, that cannot be violated by other parts. Then you have handles or connectors that decide how the parts connect together, much in the same fashion as Styliani's rules. So the Styliani rules identified some basic faces of the object and then wrote the rules for that. Then you have the actual geometry or any other thing that is not the collision mesh and let's say the geometry of the space and the connectivity. Anything else is extended data, so it's assigned later. So what assembler does is essentially produces a structure of informed voids that can later be populated by building elements. So the shape of the space does not actually reflect the shape of the built elements. And this is very important for that kind of merological individuation I was talking just earlier, because then you can also associate to the same collision volume of the part different X data that can be conditionally placed in the assemblage. So you perform a computation with the voids, and then according to the arrangement of the voids, their topological connection, their location, and environmental data, you can decide to assign one or more of the X data to the same part in the assemblage. So basic process is based on this kind of rule anatomy. So when you want to put two parts together, the basic process, each part has an index of their handles, and each part has a different name. So you have a rule that it doesn't matter right now to dissect all the syntax part by part, but you have to specify the name of the object, the handles, and the rotation in one case, and the name and the handle of the object that is sent to the receiver. There is one last part, which is the weight, that has a role in, let's say, determining the winner when you have multiple candidates that have the same chance to be chosen, because they tantamount to the same number computed assigned to them. So the system can also produce the entire table of possible rules. If you build a set of objects and their connectivity, this table is automatically generated, so it can be explored. It can automatically detect the inconsistent rules, because if you have some concave objects, you can have interpenetration of geometries. So these are automatically detected and visualized. Then you can set up the exogenous information, that is environmental data, which are basically encoded into an object that it's named field inside assembler. What a field is in assembler terms is a 3D voxelized space. So you can assign to each center of the cells, each point, each voxel point, you can assign three kind of values. a scalar value, a vector value, and a weight, an integer weight. So the way they work, so the scalar value, in this case, the scalar field is determined as an unsigned distance from the geometry, from the curve that you see there. A vector field, in this case, takes the tangent of the closest point on the curve, while the I weight are determined by this 3D Voronoi partition of the volumetric space. What they do, they provide, for example, the scalar field provides a signal that the assemblage can follow during the growth. A vector field provides information about orientation. When you have a cloud of candidates that can equally be applied, a vector field can tell assembler which is the preferred direction for the preferred candidate. So you can set the candidate there, while I weights determine the rule set that you can use in each portion of space. To explain this in a more intuitive way, I usually show this chart. So you can think about the scalar field as the temperature, the vector field as the wind, and the I weight as the rules that apply as you change going state by state. So if you cross the border between Portugal and Spain, you got different rules that apply in the two countries. So if the assemblage grows in different zones of space, that is what happened. So if in relation to the scalar field, there is a the values of the scalar field are always normalized between 0 and 1. So and you have to give a value for the scalar threshold to follow. So the assemblage will try to stay as close as possible to that threshold and then grow around it when the number of components exceeds the values that are as close as possible. So to give an example in terms of dynamics of growth, you can see the sequence. So same scalar field with two different thresholds. A threshold of 0 means that since we have an unsigned distance, means as close to the curve as possible. The threshold of 0.5 means halfway between the curve and the farthest zones of the field. So this is the same system. I had to increase the number of objects to have a complete ring of objects, because otherwise you would have seen just a partial thing, because the volumetric part to cover was larger. The vector field can determine the orientation. So in this case, this is the same assemblage seen from above and below. And there is a way of visualizing orientation that follows the convention of visualizing normals on a mesh. So you can see, for example, in this case, the vector field was split halfway horizontally. So the top part, halfway vertically, sorry. So the top part had this kind of direction of the vector field, and the bottom part has a perpendicular direction. So in this case, there is a criteria that enables following the field bidirectionally. So the parts include also direction vector. So if the direction vector is exactly aligned or aligned 180 degrees, so disregard the arrows, basically. Just look at the alignment of the vector lines. So you can see from the colors that when the split happens, the direction changes and tries to follow as much as possible the field. And when you split the space into different regions and apply two different rule sets, this is a coloration by rule set, the other coloration by orientation. So we have, we can overlap different conditions and different fields. So to put it all together, you can differentiate in many ways the kind of result that you get. So you see an orientation visualization on top, and there are these two rules with these two different rule sets. One that allows to grow only horizontally on the same plane, and the other one that allows to grow also vertically. So by extension and by interacting in the threshold zone, then the assemblage is able to grow in different ways and grow volumetrically. What happens, for example, these are some examples taken from students of mine that have been using the tool in the past years. So as you can see, the relation between the basic parts that they used and the kind of space that they obtain, the kind of architectural space they obtain is interesting because the qualities of the space exceed the qualities of the individual parts. You cannot really detect where are the individual parts in the assemblies. You actually think more in terms of, especially in here, what happens in the section of space is something that exceeds what you see in terms of property if you take the individual parts alone, or ways in which students have explored the influence of the field over the arrangements. And you can see how different the kind of segmentarity is, the way in which space is subdivided by partitions in the right side of the slide with the 3 different arrangements and 3 different, very different planimetric arrangements. Another possibility that assembler enables is to catch the topological structure of assemblies and use that to perform other computation at the global level. So, for example, you can include inside the parts some elementary circulation graphs that try to capture how you can circulate into the space, and they connect to the handle whenever the connection is possible, whenever it's not harmed or hampered by the walls, for example. But of course, you have there are several catches to this, because there are some spaces that are impossible to catch. It's let's say it's a partial way, it's not a perfect way by any means, but it can give you some indication. For example, when you compute the circulation frequency, which is simply made by trying to build a lot of circulation path by shooting a lot of input and output, ingress and egress points, and then computing how many times a single line, a single segment recurs in all the paths. So you can look at how the topology has a disposition for certain elements to be more an obligatory passage when you want to go from side to side. So it's probably somehow not an equivalent of valence in terms of topology, but it's something that can give a different weight to parts of space that are otherwise might look very, very similar or identical to each other, but they have a different way because people have to go through there sometimes. So other examples in which, for example, different hypotheses were compared in terms of frequency of circulation. So the pattern of the circulation frequency can give you other insights into how a certain assemblies of space works, because these 3-dimensional assemblies of space are pretty hard to figure out, because we have a tendency to project and to really understand the value of something that evolves 3-dimensionally and something that changes in complex way. It's not very easy. So we have to resort to analytical methods. We have seen some excellent and very interesting analytical methods in the past day and a half. So, but this is not really specific of the tool, but the assembler provides the structure to make this kind of analysis. This is done using an A-star algorithm with the shortest path just repeated over and over. But you have the structure to do that. Probably this is kind of a future development, since some regions of space are hard to compute because the formation of space, for example, some parts that are outside of but at the border of the part, like things that look like pavement, but when the part is upside down can be the underneath part can become the upper part and can be walkable. So one of the hypotheses to use nav meshes, navigation meshes that you can compute, and they give you, once you give the size and the affordances of an agent, they give you the part of space where the agents can walk. So you can have a better idea of how a space can be navigated, which spaces are reachable from whom. Another development that will be in the next version of assembler that should issue on January, is that the engine will have another version. So there's going to be the same version of the engine that does all the computation in once you get the input, the setup data. This kind of engine is split in two parts, reflecting the two different decisions, the selection of the receiver and the selection of the sender. This way, one can do iterative calculation or iterative changes in the environment and in the field. So, for example, if somebody wants to see and make a new computation based on how the receiver values are computed while the assemblers grows, it can do that. Right now, assembler relies on either a fixed set of criteria or you have to go through C# scripting to do your own. With this kind of setup, one can also use standard components of Grasshopper to build up its own method for computing receiver values, sender values. The values are the way by which candidates are compared to each other and a winner is established. And this also opens up for future developments of embedding or connecting this to reinforcement learning algorithms. So this part of selecting the receiver, selecting the sender can be connected using reinforcement learning. And instead of doing some sort of fixed criteria, fixed computation, train a neural network through observation reward patterns, the typical reinforcement learning. The only thing is that for the structure of assembler, this kind of loop needs to be done twice at every iteration, one for the receiver, one for the sender. So this is a part that it's still in the process of being in a way developed or solved, but it's in the process. So coming to the conclusion, assembler belongs to the procedural content generation family of algorithms, and all the procedural content generation come with a promise, or who uses them needs or wants these three things: novelty, variety, and control. Producing novelty, producing something that has variety, and have control over the production. So being able to steer the production in certain specific directions and not just being a victim of, or let's say, have the result of an algorithm been thrown at it without any agency or possibility to control. So assembler in this regard has the aim of being a tool for the controlled exploration of spatial structures, because it doesn't rely on random choice or random generation. It has a random criteria, but it's just for exploration purposes. But there are criteria that are entirely deterministic, and I push for the use of deterministic criteria. It is an operative playground because assemblages can be studied more in using practical methods, experimenting with them rather than just theoretically speculating about them. Actually, producing assemblages is a way of speculating about assemblages. It requires a conceptual shift, especially towards the iterative and emergent nature of the design process. I've heard in the previous presentation a lot about starting a design with the massing. So here we start exactly on the opposite end of a spectrum. So there is no massing, there is no whole, there is no definition of a whole. The parts find their own definition of a whole as they assemble and as they grow. And they are capable of organize themselves in order to produce a whole without having a definition beforehand. There are certain limits of decision-making for control and stability. Assembler right now relies on fixed heuristics, trying to implement certain reinforcement learning techniques aims at overcoming this kind of limitation. There is the possibility to write your own heuristics to a certain extent, but they are still fixed. Reinforcement learning is something different because it doesn't rely on fixed decision, but on something else. There is a certain kind of volatility. I mean, all the decisions are deterministic inside assembler, but if you change slightly certain parts, like if you shift the field density of a little while, you can get a very different result because it's iterative. It goes by propagation. A slight difference propagates into something completely different. So the system is volatile. Although it's deterministic, because if you run it 100 times with the same setup, you get 100 times the same result. And there are several things that can be done in terms of user experience and interface. It has a steep learning curve because it requires a lot of shifts in terms of how one approaches the project and understanding of the project primarily. And it's not yet streamlined for professional environment because it takes a while, especially like in all setup system, it takes a lot of iterations to set up, not to set up properly, because you can set up it in a matter of minutes, but to understand how to do this kind of thing and actually to try to understand how to put a design into profit and to make the design actually modular but able to produce variety. That is the steepest part. Just a few examples that my students have done in terms of the generated spaces, sorry. And that's the last slide. Thank you.
Automated two-story floor plan generation using generative adversarial networks.
I will talk about the automated two-story housing floor plan generation using GAN networks. It is part of my PhD research, actually. After all the professors' presentations, I'm a freshly PhD researcher. So it is a small part of my PhD research. The first part of it more like on the functional classifications of the housing space. And the second part is more on the generation part. So I will talk about the preliminary results of it. In the literature, most of the research on the one-story floor plans in terms of the learning-based generative designs. It has some graph-based models and the pixel-based models. But in terms of the two-story generation, there are certain challenges on it. First of them is the vertical circulation, because we need to manage the stairs and multi-level connections and the connection of the special functions. So in this part of research, we try to enhance and try to find some creativity through the GAN networks, which is generative adversarial networks, in automating this floor plan generation. There are some examples. One of them is Steinas Kaius. It is a pixel-based generation in single-story residential layouts. And the other one, Nautas, which try to encode the spatial relationships through graphs and learning the complex patterns. And in terms of these space integrations, we need to use some multimodality data. There are some examples on it. The first one is graph to plan. It's again using the graphs, but using with the user constraints. And the other one try to find the vertical circulation placements. However, it doesn't include the functional aspects of it. For our research, in the right part, maybe you can see in our generative model, we try to use different morphologies like rectangular, orthogonal, angular, and circular shapes of these two-story plans. Our model is also a pixel-based model, but not only pixel-based images, we also use architectural evaluation criteria. We use some numerical data, which is the geometric, topologic, and visibility-based data. So for the contribution of this study, we aim to integrate the vertical circulation into spatial relationships and balancing this functional viability, and we try to use advances of AI-driven architecture through these solutions. These learning-based algorithms, the dataset is very important, and it is very limited in the architectural area. So we try to find and combine three different data sets. The two of them is widely used in the literature, R2V and R3D data sets. We also include the key houses of 20th century data sets. So we combined them and we propose a recoloring functions. I will talk about later upon this. And then we contains our training data set with the architectural evaluation data. And then these generative adversarial networks work on with two different networks. One of them is generator network and the other one is discriminator network. So basically generator try to generate an image from a random noise vector, and then the discriminator try to differentiate between these generated outputs to the data set. So in the process, we calculate the loss function, and this, within the certain epoch, we get the results. As I mentioned, we compose the three different data sets. The first one is key houses of 20th century, which is the modern residential plans. And R2V has the Japanese, mostly orthogonal plans. And R3D is London-based, and it has also non-rectagonal plans. That is important for our research because we try to find some results on the curved and angular plans. The color labeling issue is important in terms of this image generation because the labels are the RGB colors. So the challenge was there are some open plan spaces which requires this functional ambiguity of these spaces. So in the existing data sets, they label it in just one color, so one function. But as a solution, we propose a gradient coloring. So we would like to using these RGB transitions for smooth differentiation. For this process, we use this color changing process as a path. So from one color to another color, we goes to this path. So you can think about these RGBs as a locations, like coordinates, X, Y, Z coordinates. So we want to going to a one color to another color. It is easy if the functional distribution is equal, but in most cases it is not. So we define the scale for adjusting these area sizes, and then we define some intermediate colors that's having this smooth transformation. And the other problem we faced, the traditional data sets has the floor plans just putting the side by side, and it is not the correct orientation, and it limits this vertical relationship modeling, because the algorithm learns to working with these pixels to another pixel. So the orientation must be correct. So we reoriented the use, and also to using these the connection between the lower and upper floors, we put the evaluation of these spaces. And for the GAN network, we use convolutional neural networks with the GAN networks. So there are, as I mentioned, two different network, which is the generative and the discriminator. For the generator, we use ReLU activation. It is important because in these ReLU activations, the outputs positive values. So in the discriminator, we use leaky ReLU. The difference between them, leaky ReLU allows some small negative values and preventing some dead neurons. So it provides the learning stability. And as I mentioned, other than the pixel-based properties of the space, we add some architectural criteria. One of them is entrance recognition. Just we try to identify if there is openings on the outer walls, so they are connected to functional spaces. The other one, the other openings, window placement, is important in terms of this energy cost, ventilation, and occupant well-being, and we calculated with the window to floor area ratio. And the other one is more geometrical metrics that we check the spatial distribution, the area of the functions, wind to length ratio, and number of corners for this, to check the visual complexity and the natural lighting distribution. And then the other one is the topological relationship. We choose 4 space syntax based calculation values: entropy, control value, integration, and choice values. And the other one is circulation efficiency. Since it's a 2-floor plan, it is important to have these circulation values. One of them is circulation area ratio. The other one is convexity. We calculate the curvature of the paths. And the other one is the number of connected areas to this circulation. To evaluate the network performance, we use 2 different distance methods. One of them is fresh rate inception. It measures the similarity between the ground truth image to the generated image. The other one is kernel inception distance. It is similar to FID, but the difference that it uses the kernel methods. These methods evaluate the maximum mean discrepancy between the features of these generated and the real image. So both are essential for evaluating the generative models, but it should be noted that in terms of architectural results, it is just try to calculate the ground truth image between the generated image, but in case of architecture, it doesn't have to be the same with the ground truth image. It can be another floor plan that can work actually. So as I mentioned, for the generative model, we tested 4 distinct geometry: rectangular, orthogonal, angular, and curved inputs. So it has some own characteristics and patterns in terms of these 2-story buildings. So this is the rectangular input based image. So you can see the first one is our input. The upper part of it's the ground floor, and the other one is first floor. So the gray part means it is the part of an ground floor. So in terms of these results, we can say that in common places like living room, kitchen, and dining room, or like a green coded pixels, are in the ground floor, and more private spaces like bedrooms, bathrooms, yellow pixels are located in the upper floors. So the other important part is the vertical circulations alignments. So until like epoch 300, it is misaligned, but after the epoch 300, it's just show the correct location, we can say. And this is the orthogonal input-based generations. It also has some these common spaces to the private spaces. It is important in terms of, as an input, we do not give any special relations, any graphs or any adjacencies between the spaces, just the input image. So it tries to generate in terms of these topological relations. Just the input was the topological mathematical values we give it, but the exact locations or the relation between the spaces, the algorithm generates. So this is the angular input based generations. Because of this angular shape, it has some bigger areas generated, but mostly we see that the vertical circulation, which is dark blue, are can be aligned, and then the upper floor has the yellow one is the bedrooms. It generates 3 different bedrooms separated each other, and the middle of it has the circulation areas, which call it labeled in orange pixels. And this is some last examples of these curvatures. Because it is a pixel-based generation, it has some in the, especially in the early epochs, we can see that the distinction between these spaces are not very clear. But when we coming to the epoch 400 and 300 areas, we can differentiate easily. And lastly, you see in every generation model the discriminator and the generator loss. So when we go to the 400 epochs, its loss is getting decreased. So we say that the two networks also learning. And these charts, we made the visibility analysis for these generated parts. We can see that the common areas, the more common use areas has the highest visibility values. We also try to check if any gallery spaces that has some visibility options in terms of this special quality. But unfortunately, it is only in the vertical circulation areas. So we couldn't find these. In the angular part, there are some gray parts in the ground fluorid, but doesn't have the for the first floor. The other evaluation criteria, we say that the most the negative part of it has very limited windows and the openings, because in the percentage of it's very few pixels to have these window representations. But as a area and as a geometrical distributions, it's has meaningful generations, we can say. And there are mentioned FID and KID results. So the most significant results with the orthogonals, the gray part with this one is the ground floor, the ground truth images, which is the correct, we can say correct images. But the other one is the generated ones. So these distinct metrics try to calculate how the generated output is close to the actual image. So it is just, as I mentioned, it's a performance metric for the networks, but in terms of architecture, it doesn't have to be like the ground truth images, because we don't have one correct answer in architecture. As a discussion and conclusion, we can say that it has some both potentials and limitations on these deep learning algorithms. But it is just a preliminary search on these two floors generations area. As a key finding, we can say the orthogonal designs have the best scores, because it has also majority in the data set, and the curved and angular designs have some multi-level context constraints. So it is highly dataset dependent. The quality and the diversity of the dataset is affect the results. And also, as a discussion, I can say the AI only, it's just in the a supplementary tool as an assistant in these models, because it cannot fully replicate the complex architectural design in terms of context, in terms of these other parts of the design. And also, in the particular of this model, it has lack of user control, because we just give the input and the models give us the options and alternatives of it. But there are no options to using this as an interactive design tool. And also, as an AI, there are ethical and legal considerations. So we need to somehow establish some ethical guidelines in terms of this data set. But the first and the primary, before that, I think we find a way to compose and find data sets in terms of the architecture, because it is very limited. So thank you for this. This is my presentation.
Context to 3D models, utilizing large language models in Grasshopper for automating scripting and algorithmic design of the workforce.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Should I just go full screen?
I don't know.
Maybe because there's another image that is open and the one that
Maybe.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It was simple.
So hello, everyone. My name is Stella. I'm a PhD candidate in National Technical University of Athens in School of Architecture. And this presentation is mostly about a question we're investigating that has to do with other possible ways we can utilize ChatGPT and other large language models. Apart from generating text or images, how can we leverage their capacity to actually be really good in coding in order to produce actual 3D models in parametric workflows where we can utilize them and generate them only through text in a way. So it's been like almost 2 years ago that ChatGPT launched, ChatGPT 3 in particular. And ever since, it has been it has the rumor of actually being one of the fastest growing applications and used amongst almost like all of the disciplines. And this is actually kind of a breakthrough, because it is the first time that a tool that has to do a lot with machine learning is so widely used outside the machine learning community. This is like a quite classic hierarchy of when we talk about artificial intelligence and how one falls within the clustering of the other. But the idea of artificial intelligence I guess it began around the 1950s. And the concept of machine learning that we nowadays is a particular subfield of AI, but in the days we are now and the way we work, it seems to be like identical to the general idea of artificial intelligence. And it has to do with the idea that nowadays we do not really give particular rules to how a program should be programmed, but either we actually give it an input and a desired output, and machine learning models learn the sequence of commands that they need to do in order to produce the desired outputs. So I think in the previous presentations within the AI, there's like the one main categorization that is about discriminative AI that has to do with methods that Tassos, for example, showed, that it's about predictive analytics or clustering. And there's another category that is about the generative AI. And it is this idea that now that we have actually two things. One is the processing capacity due to parallel computing, where we use not a big hypercomputer, but various computers with commodity software and hardware, actually, and we can train the models. And the other thing is that it's the very first time in history where not only we can collect the data, but we can process it and store it. So based on this, what generative AI does is it kind of learns the statistical qualities of the particular input, and then it tries to recreate them. So it may generate images of a cat, and this cat does not exist, but in a way, it has understood the idea of what is, let's say, catness. Within the generative AI realm, we have large language models, such as ChatGPT. And the thing that for those being so successful is that they are large, and this means that they have almost been trained in every information that has ever existed online. Just to have a broader spectrum of how many of those models there are out there, a few of them are also quite open source for people to let's say, to work on them. They're pre-trained because such models cannot be actually, not even universities have the processing capacity to train such models, but we can fine-tune or change certain weights in order to customize them. So in this presentation, we will be talking mostly about ChatGPT-4, which is the one we utilized. And just to understand and clarify something, LLMs do not understand what we tell them about, nor do they have any actual knowledge about those things. But what they do and the way they work is that they generate the text, and it is actually word after word. And they're really good at predicting which is the most suitable following word in a certain sentence. So how they do that is when we give them the text input. We talked about tokenization before. They take the words and they split it into further like either words or even smaller parts of letters. And they convert them into vectors, which is like numbers in a multidimensional space. And this is where after the encoding, we have the model processing, which what it does is kind of, it predicts, based on all the patterns that it has been trained on, it predicts the next type of vector, and then it translates this back to a word. And this happens so quickly that we just see, a text generating ahead of us. So, although these models do not understand what we talk to them about, what they do in a way have been trained on all the data that ever existed. So one really important matter nowadays is what they call prompt engineering, or what is like the art of asking the right questions. So they're looking into ways into how to ask those models of certain things in order to get the best out of the knowledge we can find in them. And we will be looking forward into a few ways of prompt engineering that we have tried. So they're good in answering certain questions, generating text, summarization, translation. And since they're so good in all the languages in this world, they're actually quite good in the languages that we speak with computers, which is coding. And this is the topic that we want to be focusing about. So one could map several things. We could use large language models within the architecture discipline, but the one I won't be focusing is how we can use it to automate scripting generation and facilitate mostly computational approaches and algorithmic workflows. Upon this question, like what can LLMs do and whether other people have worked on ways to integrate ChatGPT into Grasshopper, we made a small data analysis of figuring out how many plugins actually exist within the ecosystem of Food4Rhino, which is the place that people upload all the experimental or well-established plugins that they have produced. And this is actually hopefully like to catch this information at this time and place and maybe look like 2 or 3 years later. How popular has ChatGPT been into those platforms and how people have actually tried to integrate it. So what is interesting is that this is the distribution. So currently Food4Rhino has 800 plugins, and it is a long tail distribution, meaning that there are like 10 to 20 plugins that probably anyone that is into computational design has downloaded and uses. And there's like various, like 700 and more of them, which are like niche plugins. They're very exploratory and people do not really get the most out of them, or they're not really well familiar with those. So what we identified into the existing ChatGPT related plugins is that some of them are just assistants, which means that they have integrated the API of ChatGPT, but they're not really generating 3D geometries, or they might be generating components. So you give them a text description and it pops up all the components you need, but it lacks iterations and it lacks the ability and the capacity to have the geometrical reasoning so that the ChatGPT understands what is it that you want to do. So in order to bridge this gap, and we have defined the main objective to be as those 3 bullets. So one is it like, can I give it text and then get a 3D generated code that produces 3D geometries? Can I actually integrate this into an architectural software? And does these models actually have any meaning, or are they like super random and not helpful for us? So in order to answer this, we have currently developed what is a workflow. It's quite exploratory and it lacks like a certain robust, it's not a proper framework yet, but it works as a proof of concept to prove that, you know, this is possible and maybe we need to focus more our attention on that. So how it works is that we're using ChatGPT-4. And then we are asking with a certain prompting logic to provide us the Python code that we then copy-paste it into Grasshopper, and then we can get fully customizable parametric models. Something else that we tried out is because we're in design disciplines, sometimes it's better to use sketches or images as references. So instead of actually importing text, we are referencing certain images and we ask the LLM to prompt itself. So to explain what is it the geometry that they understand, and then produce the code in Python. And then we paste it into Grasshopper. And this might take a few iterations, as we will see, until we're happy with the final result and we finalize the model. I guess this is the same thing a bit more analytically. And in order to test that, we made 8 case studies that we took from Arturo Tedeschi's book about introduction into algorithmic design and Grasshopper. And we tried to integrate from a smaller to a larger scale of complexity. So what we did with each one of those was that we got the results into how do we translate them into Python code. So this means that instead of building a series of components, you just have the Python directly in a full, like in a code snippet, and you paste it into a component that is Python Grasshopper related. And in each of those case studies, we did manage to get not only the geometry that we initially had, but a model that is parametric, and you can change the parameters and get various variations upon this initial reference image. So you could move the attractor point, you could change certain tessellation parameters, and each one of those had a certain type of parameterization. And I will just showcase one of these as an example to understand how this happened. So for each one of the case studies, we have made a log that has certain metrics that we will be presenting at the next section. And what it does is that we take it step by step and we showcase what was the prompting method and what were the results and how we need to iterate on them. So we began by what they call zero-shot prompting, which means that I give you no instructions about anything, and I just hope that based on all the all on the statistic probabilities that you have seen other examples on, you just improvise and do what I want you to do. So I gave it this input as an image, and the result was kind of disappointing. But within 7 iterations, I could get exactly the model that I wanted, and this was all only by using text. So this means that instead of the zero-shot prompting, you have to do something that is called chain of thought, which means that someone with kind of a designer perspective needs to describe steps step by step. So first was to ask of it to provide, for me to provide a profile curve that I thought was suitable. And then it would create this type of geometry, and then I would need to explain that I needed to be vertical. And so we would do so, and it would start resembling the geometry that I wanted. And then I would probably ask it to have levels instead of a lofted geometry, and it would do so. And then at the very end, I would ask it to make it parametric for me so I can adjust the height or explain how many several layers I want, etc., etc. And so the concept was that after we did those case studies, we imported some different images with objects that have like quite specific geometries, just to evaluate that as a proof of concept, this works. And we do have the capacity to integrate language models in order to directly design 3D geometries. Concerning the metrics, what we in our logs, what we wrote down was first of all the number of iterations, then how many times was there bugs in the code, which means that there were syntax errors. Then the user input refinements, like how many times would it require for me, the human, to explain step by step what it needs to do. The accuracy is how similar it is to the original input image we gave, and the usability is how parametric it is and how much I can adjust it afterwards. So here on the x-axis, given from the book, we have classified each of the examples from smaller complexity to higher complexity. So what it seems was that in simple geometries, it might take 2 or 3 iterations, while on the most advanced ones, it took like 21 iterations, which means at this point, you may just do it by hand. And the more complex it becomes, the less accuracy and usability we might have from the outcomes. Concerning the code bugs, there were usually 2 to 3 bugs in each type of the code and revision we had. But this didn't really change according to complexity. What changed was, again, the user guidance that was required. So what happened at this point was that there are certain aspects that we need to work on. One has to do with evaluation from different people and different geometries that might be tested. And of course, we're working on integrating as an API within the Grasshopper in order to start putting together probably a plugin. However, there are many iterations, which means you need to pay many tokens. So this is not fully viable yet. And then we are putting up together like a catalog with more concrete advices on prompt engineering, on how to need to have less iterations, and other aspects on the advancement of geometrical reasoning that need to take place, probably from the computer science perspective. But what it worked was that it did prove the feasibility of this idea. It does allow us to guide it towards the direction we want, so it does allow us to iterate. It does allow us, and it seems to be successful, that we can use an image as a prompt and not just text. And what is actually quite accessible is that at this point, you don't actually need to know Python in order to make this work. But on the other side, it does need a certain designer to be able to direct the prompts. It does make logical errors, which means that it generates geometries that might seem irrelevant. And also the code can be quite buggy sometimes. But yeah, that should be it. And feel free to maybe see this repository and try your own iterations. So thank you.
The expert systems, we call them, was the fashion then. Unfortunately, they didn't deliver what was expected to. Remember that the Japanese spent billions trying to produce logical computers with language like Prolog, and they didn't succeed. So we are still in the AI field. Well, please. I think it is a very strong panel. Please.
I just have a maybe a basic suggestion for Stella. First of all, like 2 weeks ago, Llama, a team from NVIDIA released Llama Mesh, which is a kind of a Llama-based mesh, and it does output just mesh. It outputs like triangulated kind of meshes, yeah, coordinate systems. So that's one, but you don't have to go that route because it's better if you do your own. So the other thing is that I got this idea when you said that if you do zero shot, so if you ask for the question first time, of course you get like a bit of a weird result, let's say, or garbage. But then when you do like a 7 shot, I think you said 7 iterations, so I assume like 7 shot, let's call it 7 shot. It would be then you get better. So it's like, you know, you're just priming it a bit. So a last layer fine tuning on a very small model, open source model like the Llama 11B Vision, which is just 11 billion parameters, the LLM, and it has the like a clip equivalent. So clip is the type of network that embeds images, let's say, into higher dimensional space. Then you match the LLM and the image to the same higher dimensional space. So if you fine tune just the last part of the LLM, probably with just, if your 7 shot works, then you'll have something that probably produces similar or better results, because it's a very smart way probably for you, because you're an architect, to use Grasshopper to do the heavy lifting for you in the manipulation. So you get away with an LLM that it's not well trained, but you can do it. If it's 7 shot work for you, it's quite cool. You can probably fine tune an 11B, which is a small model, but still.
Thank you very much for the suggestion. We have a good chances that it can work.
Yeah, probably with you need to build. Probably you need to ask a couple of architects or students to make like probably even 100 or 200 maybe examples of input output. So what you ask and what you expect to see as movements in Grasshopper space, maybe I would call it. I don't know how you encode things. You would get like way better.
Thank you. We will attribute the future work to you. No, thank you. It's very helpful, and I think there are various ways now that you can even customize your own ChatGPT, where you can upload, let's say, the documentation of all the Grasshopper components. So that was one idea, but also working with Llama is probably a better one. And I think that this is very helpful because this is quite exploratory. It was like an idea. Can we actually do anything else rather than text and images? So thank you for that input, and it will be wisely.
An AI is the RAG equivalent.
Exactly.
Is the RAG equivalent, not the fine-tuning equivalent, which is different. But yes, if you throw the whole PDF of the manual, I'm not sure if you're going to get the brain of an architect. It's just a manual. You might not get it, but it might be a good comparison for you, to be honest.
It could be
to compare, because it's a function, like architects maybe function more than just reading a manual. If you can make an open AI model, which is okay, a fairly smart one, just with a manual to do maybe imaginary kind of build shapes like sculpting. It's like sculpting pretty much, right? Maybe that's a good comparison for your PhD over there.
Thank you. And hopefully there are many scripts available online. So RAG is when you upload all the information you have to an LLM, and instead of hallucinating and saying its own stuff, it actually retrieves information from its retrieval augmented. So this might be helpful, and also maybe not only the documentation, but uploading a series of examples of actual scripts with components. So.
The task though, because RAG has issues if it's not like, let's say, a medical science library or something very, very specific to your problem, because it just extracts information and rewrites it. But you want also, I think it's a bit more fundamental, let's say, let's call it knowledge. So movements, yeah, I don't know. It's maybe again other.
Thank you, though.
More? Oh, you.
I have a question for Stella. If you claim that you can use it without code knowledge, but then
louder, please.
But then it makes box. Then you have box. Then how do you fix the box if you don't know the code?
I'm going to give you an answer that is really not scientific at all, but so what I did, I wanted to give it the minimum prompt each time. So what I did was I copy paste the when you have a bag, you have a message. So I just copy paste the bag, and because it was syntax mostly, it was not when it was about the logic of the design, I needed to define it myself. When it was about syntax and the fact that it uses RhinoScript library, so it might not really know the. Instead of revolve, it would say, I don't know, revolution or something irrelevant. So I would just copy paste back and it would fix it. So I mean, it's not a nice thing to say. It's always good to understand what's wrong, but you know, it sounds a bit provocative to say you need no coding.
So sorry, I have 3 questions. So I'm just going to go three at the same time. For Alessio, you mentioned that conceptually you don't start with a big mass or big kind of scheme and you let the generation happen. But is there a way for the user to predict what is going to happen based on the design of the small parts? Is there an intuition about where we're going to end up by looking just at how we design the small parts?
In the beginning, no, but that's also kind of the point. You can build an intuition after rounds of input-output. So when you put the parts in action, you can start understanding how the certain affordance of connectivity can then lead to certain expression of the system. Then you build a knowledge through experimentation. And over time, then you start already building an intuition of given previous experience. If I design a part of space in a certain way, that will enable certain connectivities. And that will enable, or if I design the connectivity in a certain way, that will enable certain things to happen. in the growth. So let's say with zero knowledge of the system and zero experience of the system, in general, it's not possible to understand the potential of a given part. Building up some experience, you can acquire experience on the input-output relation, but it's since it's methodological and it's stable by combinatorial design, you can start to understand or start to experiment more directionally, not just randomly, but let's say, okay, if I change the shape this way, this would probably enable this sort of effect. Or if I change the connectivity in a certain way. So for example, just to give an example, some student found a way of building courtyards in the system, and not just fixed dimension courtiers, but variable dimension courtiers, and to regulate the distribution of those courtiers in the system. Although not really the control of over the final shape, but how the distribution of certain features could work.
Okay, and just as a follow-up, is there repeatability in your system in the sense that if I run it in one session and I come back 2-3 days later and run it, would I get the result, or is there already an inherent randomness that would not give me the same result?
No, it's totally deterministic. So if you run 1,000 times with the same initial setup, you get 1,000 times the same result.
Okay, thank you.
Although, like I was saying, it's volatile. So for example, if you have the field, you move the field 1 centimeter to the right, you might have a completely different result.
Yes, yeah. Okay, thank you. And just one more question for Rudi. You showed at the end the fact that you can apply it to different plots of land, plots of, and it can adapt to those. Can you just give us an idea what's the limitation in terms of, does it reject plots that would violate the Leverhouse kind of rules or good architecture rules? Does it have some kind of pushback, or does it adapt to any plot of land?
No, I mean, it could, but there are definitely limitations to it, in the sense that, I mean, for example, in order to define a grid, you have to choose a point as to, where you start measuring the grid, and then you have to align it to a side. So I would definitely, I mean, we didn't try it out, but I would definitely assume that if you come up with a really odd plot, or maybe not a with regular, I mean with straight line edges, that it would not necessarily work. But of course, to be honest, I mean it's a made up scenario, right? So we just built a parametric model, and we could build it, of course, in any way to be as general or as specific as possible. The question is to combine it with the kind of work that Stella is doing, but then on an architectural level, on a conceptual level of what is a site, what is a grid, what is a massing, what is a column, etc. These kind of concepts, to combine these to then see, then definitely I think even more there will be limitations to it. But if you can work with a large language model and you can really refine the result, you could potentially eliminate any limitation that you encounter.
Obrigado. First of all, thank you all for your presentations. I have two questions, sorry. One for Rudi. I believe it is in the sequence of what was said just before. But I would like to ask if the current implementation of the demonstration is this a framework for a future implementation, or is it going to be different the development of a future implementation. You talked about classes. Are they broad enough so that they can encompass the variability of spaces in urban and architectural design? Sorry.
Thank you very much. So the issue here in our research, in our work, is to find the right balance between, I mean, finding the time to do the research, finding the funds to support the research. So definitely, you know, our aim, our objective is to make it all happen. I think there's you know, an incredible potential to treat generative design in this kind of way, in a way also, you know, where the architect is communicating and talking together with the system. But there are a lot of steps that have to be done. There are a lot of things that have to be tried out. To, you know, to an important extent, the research that Aries was presenting, it also falls within this kind of exploration. So I don't have a clear view of how many steps we need to do. But to answer your question, the most important thing is, of course, to define this ontology, this vocabulary. What are the components that we are dealing with? And we definitely don't want to make it assume like, okay, if only everybody designs like this, then we can help you. So it cannot be that you are required to first define a grid and then a massing and then etc. You should be able to go back and forth or start from another completely other point of view, as Alessio was saying. But yeah, I mean, to define all the concepts, I think it will be you know, an exploratory development where you start with a few like this. If we can translate this into AI steps and then slowly add to it to enrich the vocabulary.
Sorry, because the question is a follow-up. The next question I have is, oh, sorry. But since every building is by definition unique because it exists in a context, even if they are quite similar, for example, the unité d'habitation could be everywhere and could be different in the place it was. Are patterns, instead of statistical relevance, the underlying basis for every model produced? What I mean is that the classes that by themselves define some kinds of patterns, are they the basis, the underlying basis, or and if yes, doesn't that bound the variability of the large language model and the neural graph and the possibility of parameter expansion of the neural network?
I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, I would say that ideally, of course, as the architect, you should just be able to express yourself, and then it should define any class corresponding to what you uniquely want. Of course, that is, you know, very well, at this point, at least, very far. So we have to start with, you know, common concepts that we know have some value, at least for some designs. But you're right. You know, in the end, that's also why we are focusing right now on, let's say, conventional buildings, even if complex, because there are certain similarities between them that we can build upon. But of course, as an architect, you always want to stand out. You want to be unique. So there is certainly that limitation to overcome. And I don't, you know, exactly have the full answer to that.
Okay, so I would like a comment on that. Govind was first. A little comment on that. We are all different, although there is a science called psychology that explains the equal behaviors of all of us, and that is the real base of science. Of course, science these days, when we try to generalize from individual to a great group of individuals, we have to generalize with abstraction. Those are the two necessary tools, mind tools, analysis and synthesis. We go to Descartes to know that. Well, unfortunately, when we abstract, we are and generalize. We are saying, well, in the extreme, we are saying for everything, absolutely nothing, because you generalize so much, then you get that. Well, but the science is, and for one individual, we know nothing about, we know everything about nothing, and we know nothing about each individual. But science has this wonderful characteristic that it can generalize without the wrongs of abstraction. It can create things that apply to the general and also to the particular. This is the characteristic of science that well, we praise more. Well, it's our actual our epoch of civilization got there. No. Well, but I said in the morning that each particularly has all the abstracts, all the essence, and it has in a different way. Each particular is different for each other, but because it concatenates differently all the essence. So you are right also, because we must see how the essence particularize in each individual. So it's not wrong what you said, but you must think that is, well, I would say a dialectical issue that we must work with our science, our methodologies, and so. Okay, thank you. COVID.
So, hello, am I audible? Okay, so this is for Professor Rudi. I just wanted to understand when we are talking of this category theoretic framework, what kind of category are we talking about? Is it something like a symmetric monoidal category, or what is the category that has been identified, or are we going to identify this as we move on? Because each of them is a specialization, and each of them will have their own, set of characteristics.
That's a good question. I must say I don't have the answer for that at this moment, but it's a good point. I will need to look into that definitely.
I mean, it's just a follow-up that I just want to understand. Is that I understand category theory a bit, but I would like to see what are the constraints that are there, because I understand that there are objects and morphisms, but there are constraints which are specific to how things will compose, how associativity will work and things like that. So where does that come into picture when you're doing a generative design?
Yeah, exactly. That's the point. So admittedly, we didn't start from category theory. We had a concept, and then we basically looked for a model that could, describe this, and that's how we got to category theory. But you're right. I mean, there's more to it, and So the point is to understand better how, what the implications are of using this model or this, concept of category theory for, so initially it nicely fits into this, but we haven't looked into, the details as you, that you point out. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Would you like to answer? Meta, please.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for all your presentations. Very. I mean, it's not. I'm on the urban level, but it was still very fascinating to hear about these advancements in architectural composition and on the building scale. I'm a bit. Let's say I have two questions, kind of, and I'm not sure. Probably all of you can answer on them. They're kind of more general. And one is about, I kind of linking also back to the presentation of Wasim this morning. There seems to be that you either focus on the assemblage or the composition of objects, so the elements or the parts or whatever we call them, while the configurational aspect is actually more what is in between these objects and how that relates. And it seems that we either do one or the other and not in combination. While if we do, let's say, when we're designing our, let's say, sort of analog, we of course always have both in mind, if you see what I mean. So it's either in your case the where you have the massing in a way that is organized. In your case, it's the elements that kind of in iterative manner, Alessio, grow, let's say, and become a structure. But that's actually it's a set of elements that are then put together, and then the result is a configurational structure, but it's not the input. So it's either that we always have to come from one of these inputs, and I'm a bit wondering, could we combine them? Because I think actually that would give a better result. That was one question. And the other question I'm a bit sort of thinking about after all these presentations, you talk so little about performance or what it, let's say, what it leads to, what the impact is. And I thought can you reflect on if you would start there, what kind of patterns would we get then? So if we want to have a structure where we gather a lot of people along a certain path, how would then all these parts be put together instead of now it's a result? And then we have to figure out, do we find this good? Is it performing well? And I'm asking this question also because, I mean, we are living in a world where we have a lot of challenges, health, biodiversity, climate impacts, and somehow our advancements in all these new methods should be to, I think, to arrive at the world that actually is performing better in terms of, well, creating more well-being, I mean, you don't have to handle these big questions, somehow, could you reflect, let's say, whether your approaches could really sort of bring us a step further in those questions and how?
This is for all of us.
I'll give it a start. Maybe I'll start with the second question. I mean, on the one hand, I have a very easy answer in the sense that we talked about the effectiveness and efficiency of generating these 3D models from the abstract design. So this is the kind of performance. But I understand, of course, that there's also, much more interesting performance to look at. I have to admit that at this point, the idea is more to, let's say, take a kind of like a reactive approach in the sense where we can generate anything and then analyze and then see what the result is and then, do this kind of feed forward. Yes. But obviously it would be much better if we can embed these performances. It's kind of like the experience that Nathaniel Owing was describing. So that experience could be about, how the people move around or other aspects that of there. So the question is importantly how to characterize this or how to represent this. I mean, it's a very good question, and definitely something that we should be exploring. But yeah, that's as far as my answer would go at this moment. I think in terms of the configurational, that's on the one hand, I would disagree, but at the same time, my arguments would probably be relatively weak to disagree with you. So I don't think that is very, very good step forward either. So yeah, I mean, maybe looking, I mean, obviously we're emphasizing the configurational. I don't think we're de-emphasizing necessarily the elements, but maybe we can, explore how to go further in that or, do more with that. Yeah.
I can comment on this in terms of my concern on these computational design methods, because in terms of the performance, sometimes it has some risk to evaluate the design if it has a good performance on maybe structural performance, climatic performance, it has a good design. But however, there are also human issues, so more social ways. So that's why in our case for my PhD also, we try to focus on some special qualities like the ambiguity of these special functions and some visual relations. So I think it has some risks in that kind of computational design areas that we also consider these user impacts and the cognition of the users. And also there are lots of studies on these optimizations and the genetic algorithms in terms of these performance issues. But the learning-based algorithm has some potentials on that, can learn from these data sets and maybe interpret the context of it or the architectural language if there is a certain data set of the architectural firms or an architect. So I think to explore on these areas, to me, for more interesting in that point. But of course, design is a full package thing, so we cannot exclude these performance issues. I think it can be also included in the further studies. Thank you.
For me, maybe the answer might be a little complex and long. I try to shorten it up. About the first question about structures and parts, the tool that I built is built out of some of my concerns and intentions in research, although it's general enough that it can be used in different ways and misused. And I want it misused to understand what can it do. But one of the concerns is to try to not being enclosed in my own limits of thought, to use tools as techniques like machinic techniques to go into territories where I would never go myself. And it's something that I've learned from artists like Richard Serra, for example. He builds tools to explore, for example, you know the story of Richard Serra probably, that he used to paint, then he dropped this paint completely, then it started to do a list of verbs and actions and materials and started to mechanically produce this thing, or like Jackson Pollock, like it's all about the mechanic of the arm, right? But so the tool is made to explore self-building structures, because the part by means of their connectivity, all that assembler produces are structures basically. The user designs parts, but assembler can show or can help. It can be a probe to explore the space of possibilities of the structure that are formed out of those parts. And then being completely deterministic in that sense, it gives the user the possibility of steering the exploration partially. And then the idea is to build, translating into the second question, the idea starts from a study of architecture of people like the Dutch structuralists like Piet Blom or Herman Hertzberger or Jona Friedman, that started from a social concern about the use of space. So in particular, the way in which Blom uses geometry is exactly as understanding the geometry of part in terms of the social relations that happen in that part. And then for the Pestalozzi village, for example, which was the example I was showing in one of the slides, he uses the geometry as a generator of a structure. And he was talking about a quality that he wanted, that was, he called it himself the labyrinthic clarity. Not a clarity about the whole structure, like forming an image of the whole in the mind of the user, but knowing how to navigate it. So, for example, same in the Pestalozzi village, you can see that the dimension of the courtyards has a specific sequence. And you always go from the larger to the smaller, or from the smaller to the larger. And if you go this way, you're going radially through the structure. And if you translate from a courtyard into a courtyard of the same dimension, you're going in a circle or in an arc. So it gives you a way of orienting yourself locally and regionally throughout the structure without having to memorize the entire map of the structure, because the structure gives you hints about how it works in terms of navigation. So my aim is, in general, try to cope this and to build these spatial assemblages as forms of habitats, so that in general try to explore a dimension in which architectural and urban dynamics happen in the same place. Try to dissolve a little bit the distinction, the sharp distinction between building and street, for example. And this has a resonance, for example, or to explore the resilience of buildings, so that you don't give a specific functional program, but you give enough articulation to the space so that it proves to be polyvalent and resilient over time. And it can be converted. Case in point, the Beher offices by Erzberger, that's being converted right now into housings without changing anything about the structure or anything substantial about the structure of the building. And that is, Erzberger did a movie recently called The Proof of the Pudding that talks exactly about this case. Or in general, there's something called the gray infrastructure, that is the urban infrastructure, that is a concern about overcoming climate change for the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC. In one of the reports, they acknowledge the fact that it's one of the shape of the urban environment, of the built environment, like self-shading of the buildings, microclimate in streets, is one of the most important factor in mitigating, for example, heat island in cities, or all these factors. But they also acknowledge the fact that there is little to none exploration in changing the urban form and experimenting how this change, because the urban infrastructure is very hard to change. So my kind of projects in a certain way are also speculation about how this intricate and potentially growing spatial structures can provide models to have a different way of understanding circulation, distribution of facilities, function, social ways of interpreting space. And of course, there is assembler itself is not a tool that does the analysis, but it provides a structure to plug in any kind of analysis one wants to use to drive the generation.
Maybe just an extra comment from my side, because I think the second question was actually a very good one. It's a bit of a cliche for me, the answer I'm going to give, but I think when we need to tackle big issues, I think we become somehow narrow-minded, meaning that we either go into a computational approach and we end up into closed systems and metrics and, numbers and fine-tuning something very specific only we know about. When we're being critical, we need to look into the more social and political aspects, and then we sometimes stay in theory and we do not have the capacity to go, into design. And I think the answer to all of that is, at least from what I'm beginning to see, we need to formulate teams that are truly interdisciplinary, because now I think that architects, that's a good thing. We believe we can do a bit of everything, which is good, but it probably could be really cool if we had someone that is a proper mathematician, a proper, computer scientist, a proper, from the sociological aspects as well. And I think, to me, this is the trap that I see myself falling into. I try to become each one of these, and I forget the other. I need to be part of a bigger team, to me, in order to tackle
Maybe
Thank you. Very, very interesting answers. And I think we are the specialists on space. So that's where we come into the room. And therefore, all these presentations are fascinating and very good. So indeed, we need a sociologist, we need an ecologist, we need, let's say, all these people. But nobody can put things together in space. And that's what we do. But I'm kind of, let's say, my question about this more structural or object-oriented compositions or assemblages that I posed. Just as a comment back on what you said, I was actually quite fascinated, because when you started talking, it was almost as if you were explaining space syntax. But then that's not exactly not what you're doing. You are kind of on the opposite. And the effect is there, of course, because these spaces that are there, they create a configuration and let's say, and you can do analysis of centrality that you actually showed. But you start off from, let's say, so I think it's design methodology. So you start from the parts and put them together almost sculpturally, let's say, and the program you have does that for you. What would happen if you would start from actually making first this sort of path through your structure? If that's the starting point and the rest follows, that would give you, it's just a different design methodology and has a very different output. And if the purpose is to explore the impact of, let's say, what kind of built environment you are creating, it would be interesting to be able to choose as an end user, where do I want to start? Do I start to making this bigger structure in terms of, let's say, how spaces are linked together and create shortest path and high centralities, etc., and then the rest follows? Or do you start with the composition of the elements, and then the effect is that you also have a certain shortest path through your structure? I think, let's say, if the aim is that, then it would be interesting that you could choose as an end user and see what happens actually. It then becomes almost, it becomes a pedagogical tool, let's say, for designers to explore what does the one and what does the other.
Maybe I'd like to make a comment on this issue, because I think it's very important. Well, what I see about the diverse proposals that are made for architectural automation, and here we have several of them, but I think we can group them on two approaches. First, the inductive approach with the new AI. Well, we analyze data with the neural networks and diffuse logic, and we obtain some results. For example, your solution and others there. Well, if in the input data we put the social evaluation or assessment, we assess the solutions already existent that are analyzed for creating the general rule. Well, this is very seldom made, but it could be made. You analyze 1,000 buildings and you ask the society to evaluate the 1,000 buildings. So we get some rules to analyze and produce with the degree of the qualifications we want for the building. For example, but I say this is not made only rarely disappears. Well, the other is the grammar school. You create forms with rules. Well, those rules already incorporate some of the mental knowledge, know-how of the architect. Well, if the rules are with take care of that situation, you can make good designs only with that rule. But it's very difficult to incorporate for example, space syntax in the rule. So what is made is generate forms with the grammars, and then we have a second, and generally this creates thousands of solutions, and then we create a second phase that is analyzing the product solutions with shape grammar, with structural analysis, and environmental analysis, and so on, so that we can arrive to a solution, or select the solution that provides the best solution according to our patterns. Well, this is a very used, those two phases methodologies used a lot, but not every time. For example, I think of Zadid produces with shape grammar, produces some form. But why that form? There is any explanation, social, psychological? Well, I see the market explanation, but well, it's a good explanation. I don't deny it's also a social explanation. Well, but for example, the covering of the patio of British Museum, it's also a form generated in some way similar, but it responds to one absolutely crucial question. It is the optimal form for structural reasons. The engineer that made that, it's famous. And many of other forms, structural forms, are designed to perform the best solution, that uses the least material, well, the lighter one. So I think with those type of methodologies, we can arrive with a lot of work. We can arrive to some good solutions regarding what we want to, well, what are the needs for society, or anything else. Well, more.
Maybe the question was also for me. I wanted to just maybe there's a misunderstanding because I don't start with a path. The assemblies do not start with a path in the tool. The path is the result of an analysis, and it can be also exactly the way in which one can find the critical sinks in circulation and then can modify the project in the next iteration. The ability to choose is partly the thing I'm trying to work on the aspect of polyvalence of spaces, or how the spaces are designed for multiple interpretation. But the topology in a spatial structure gives a good account of the disposition of that system. So I'm referring to, for example, Paul Barron's famous diagram about centralized, decentralized, and distributed system. There is this essay about networks of communication that applies to any sort of circulation of information, data, people, whatever. But it gives you a topological account of the distribution of importance and power in a system, for example. So if a node has a certain valence, it has a more importance than other nodes. So if the circulation causes certain paths to be privileged by means of connection, by means of pure connectivity, pure topology, it means that those are more important, more vital for the circulation of the entire system. That is just the analytical perspective. What the designer does with that information, that is up to the designer then to say, I want to change that, then I need to change how the circulation works inside the system. And it can be done if somebody inputs a different graph into the parts with the same structure, it can have a very different circulation graph. So there is the tool is done exactly with the possibility to iterate this exploration as fast as possible and give back the more significant amount of information possible.
Okay, I think it's over now. We can go to the coffee break and then to the final session of today. Thank you.